Vivian Blackwood believed the old employee badge was the final humiliation she needed to hand Callum Reed, the single father she had once fired from her private airfield without a second thought. She tossed it onto the boardroom table and laughed softly in front of the entire council, telling him to leave her runway and never come back. But when the security door slid open a moment later, the head of the guard force stood at attention and addressed him as the new owner of the property beneath their feet. From that instant, every jet, every contract, and every fragment of Vivian's empire would need Callum's permission to move. If you enjoy stories where quiet people turn the tables on the powerful, tap subscribe now so you never miss the next reversal. The glass conference room sat high above Blackwood Aero Terminal, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a private runway lined with gleaming jets. Vivian Blackwood had assembled her board, a handful of nervous investors, and her legal team to finalize the sale of a secondary airfield to a partner corporation, and she wanted the meeting to feel like a coronation rather than a negotiation. Callum Reed had been summoned under the pretense of signing off on old maintenance paperwork, and he arrived in a plain jacket, his face tired but composed, carrying none of the anger that might have made this easier for everyone watching. Vivian let him stand at the front of the room like a laborer waiting for instructions, a small performance meant to remind the investors exactly how far he had fallen. She opened a slim metal box and produced his old security badge, the very credential that once let him into every maintenance bay, fuel depot, and hangar on the property. She said Blackwood Aero no longer had room for men who lived off the memory of what they used to be, and she slid the badge across the table as though returning a broken tool, letting the insinuation about his old dismissal hang in the air. Prescott Wainwright, her chief operating officer, added his own remark, suggesting Callum keep the badge as a souvenir, since it was the only proof left that he had ever been allowed inside these walls at all. Callum studied the badge for a long moment, then asked a single quiet question: was she certain she wanted to return it today? The room laughed at what they assumed was a pathetic attempt at dignity, and Vivian allowed herself a satisfied smile before moving on to the next item on her agenda. One of the younger board members leaned toward a colleague and whispered that this was exactly the kind of theater Vivian enjoyed most, reminding the room who truly held authority whenever she sensed anyone questioning it. Prescott straightened his tie and added that men like Callum served a useful purpose now and then, if only as a reminder to everyone else in the company of what happened to those who caused problems for the wrong people. Callum absorbed the remark without any visible reaction, having long since learned that arguing with men like Prescott only wasted energy better spent elsewhere. Callum slipped the badge into his jacket pocket without another word, and as he did, a small indicator on the terminal's access panel blinked green, a notification appearing only on the security office's monitor far below, owner-level credential reactivated. Nobody in the glass room noticed, since every eye remained fixed on Vivian as she moved briskly toward the next item on her agenda, eager to close the meeting and return to the more important business of finalizing her sale. Only Nolan Greer, the head of airfield security sitting quietly at his console 2 floors down, saw the alert and frowned, already reaching for his radio. He had worked at Blackwood Aero long enough to know that credential levels above standard employee access were never issued casually, and he intended to understand exactly why a badge belonging to a man escorted off the property years earlier had just reactivated with authority he had never seen assigned to anyone outside the ownership registry itself. 3 years earlier, Callum Reed had been the chief maintenance engineer for Blackwood Aero, a man who had climbed into the industry the hard way, working night shifts as a mechanic before earning his commercial pilot's license through years of study he paid for himself. His wife had died young, leaving him to raise their daughter alone, and though she appears only briefly in this story through a single short phone call, her presence shaped every decision he made afterward. He had built a reputation as the kind of engineer who caught problems nobody else wanted to see, and it was that instinct that put him directly in the path of a decision that would nearly destroy his career. Colleagues who worked beside him in those years remembered a man who arrived before sunrise and stayed long after the hangar lights dimmed, checking torque values twice and reading manuals other engineers had stopped opening long ago. He never sought credit for the problems he caught, preferring instead to file a quiet report and move on to the next inspection without fanfare. That habit made him invisible to executives who measured value in headlines and appearances, even as it made him indispensable to every pilot who trusted their lives to his signature on a maintenance log. Vivian rarely spoke to him directly in those days, knowing him only as a name on a payroll report that Prescott occasionally mentioned in passing, a detail that would later matter more than either of them realized. He discovered a serious flaw in the hydraulic system of a Gulfstream assigned to a high-profile flight, and he recommended the trip be delayed until the issue was resolved. Prescott Wainwright needed that flight to depart on schedule because the executives aboard were closing a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and any delay threatened to unravel months of negotiation. Prescott pressured the maintenance team to override the warning, but Callum refused to sign off on a report he knew to be false, insisting the aircraft was not safe to fly that day. Hours later, the flight was grounded anyway when the exact failure he predicted began to manifest on the tarmac, vindicating his judgment in front of everyone who mattered. Instead of gratitude, the leadership team needed someone to blame for the damaged deal, and Prescott quietly altered the maintenance logs to suggest Callum had tampered with the aircraft without authorization. Vivian, trusting her chief operating officer completely at the time, signed the termination order without asking a single hard question, and Callum was escorted off the property within the hour. He remembered walking past the same hangar doors he had once unlocked every morning, carrying a cardboard box of tools and photographs while junior staff avoided meeting his eyes, uncertain whether sympathy might cost them their own positions. The silence of that walk stayed with him longer than the accusation itself, a quiet reminder that loyalty inside a company like this one rarely survived contact with convenience. Before he left the property for what he assumed would be the last time, an elderly shareholder named Walter Hawthorne, a longtime creditor tied to the company's earliest loans, pressed a thin folder into his hands and told him that someday that badge would open exactly the door they thought they had locked forever. Walter had watched Blackwood Aero for decades, long before Vivian inherited its leadership, and he recognized in Callum the same stubborn integrity that had once defined Thaddeus Blackwood before ambition reshaped the company's priorities. Callum did not understand the remark then, assuming it was simply the kindness of an old man trying to soften a difficult day, and he tucked the folder away without reading it closely for months afterward. Blackwood Aero had once secured its early expansion loans against Hangar 7, the secondary runway, and the ground operations rights for the Eastern Airfield, and that folder would become the foundation of everything that followed, though neither man could have predicted exactly how or when. Back in the present, Blackwood Aero was preparing to receive a delegation of investors flying in on 3 private jets from New York, a deal that would determine whether Vivian retained control of her family's company or watched the bank seize it through an old recovery clause buried in decades-old paperwork. Vivian carried herself with pride, but beneath the composure she was under enormous pressure, since her father, Thaddeus Blackwood, had built this empire decades earlier and left behind loans and governance decisions that now threatened to topple everything he created. Prescott had convinced her to sell the secondary runway and Hangar 7 to a group of investors he described as trustworthy partners, offering a price that seemed reasonable only if nobody looked too closely at who actually stood behind the purchasing group. Callum had not come that morning looking for a job or an apology. He had received a letter requiring his signature on old records tied to Hangar 7, paperwork Vivian assumed was a harmless formality, and she seized the moment to humiliate him in front of her board rather than treat the request with any seriousness. While the meeting continued, the airfield's operations system flagged an approaching storm system, warning that crosswinds at the main runway were about to exceed safe limits for incoming aircraft. The secondary runway, the very asset everyone in that glass room treated as worthless, suddenly became the only viable landing option for the delegation's 3 jets. Prescott assured the room that every permit and operational right still belonged to Blackwood Aero without exception, brushing aside the storm warning as a minor inconvenience that would resolve itself within the hour. Vivian, distracted by the pressure of closing her deal, accepted his reassurance without pressing further, though something about his eagerness to dismiss the warning nagged quietly at the back of her mind. In the security office below, Nolan Greer had already begun cross-checking Callum's badge data against the property's ownership records, a routine verification he ran automatically whenever an unfamiliar credential tier appeared on his monitor. What he found did not match the file for a former employee at all. The credential level attached to Callum's badge corresponded instead to an ownership tier reserved for holders of the airfield's underlying property rights, a classification Nolan had only seen assigned twice before in his entire career at the company. He cross-referenced the badge number against 3 separate registries before allowing himself to believe what the data plainly showed, aware that an error of this magnitude would need to be handled with absolute precision. This detail made Nolan set down his coffee and reach immediately for the phone, dialing the legal department directly rather than routing the concern through his usual supervisor, since he suspected correctly that this was not a matter that could wait. Callum left the glass room and walked down toward the hangar district without waiting to be dismissed, and a young staffer tried to stop him at the perimeter gate, assuming a former employee had no business anywhere near restricted property. Callum did not argue with him. He simply held his old badge to the scanner mounted beside the door, and the heavy steel gate of Hangar 7 rolled open in front of both of them. Every security camera on the property captured that moment, and Nolan Greer called the legal department within seconds of watching the feed. Property records confirmed that Callum's badge had not been issued by Blackwood Aero's current administration at all, but by the Hawthorne Aviation Trust, an entity that had just completed a recovery process after Blackwood defaulted on the terms of an old loan agreement. Inside the dim hangar, Callum walked past equipment gathering dust, past a maintenance board still chalked with notes from years earlier, past photographs of a technical crew that no longer existed in any official capacity. Boone Calder, an old friend and longtime mechanic at the airfield, met him near the back office and explained what had happened while Callum had been away. Walter Hawthorne had passed away quietly the year before, but not before transferring the rights to purchase Blackwood's outstanding loan to a small holding company Callum had quietly established with legal guidance from the trust. Callum had not become wealthy overnight. He had spent years building a case documenting Prescott's fraud, and when combined with the trust's support, that evidence let him acquire the undervalued debt long before anyone at Blackwood realized what was happening. Boone explained that Walter had reached out to him privately after Callum's dismissal, asking quiet questions about the maintenance records and the timeline of that final flight, questions that eventually led Walter to suspect the official story did not match what actually happened in the hangar that week. Rather than confront Blackwood directly, Walter chose to wait, believing that a company built on concealment would eventually stumble under the weight of its own decisions without anyone needing to push it. Callum had spent those years working smaller maintenance contracts under a different name, rebuilding his reputation piece by piece, while quietly assembling the paper trail that would one day matter far more than any apology ever could. Boone admitted he had kept a duplicate set of files locked in an old toolbox for years, uncertain whether he would ever need them, relieved now that the wait had finally come to an end. Standing among the dust-covered equipment, Callum ran his hand across a workbench he had built with his own hands more than a decade earlier, remembering nights spent troubleshooting engines long after everyone else had gone home. The training charts on the wall still listed his name beside the technicians he had once supervised, most of whom had scattered to other airfields after his departure rather than stay under Prescott's authority. He felt no triumph standing there, only a steady, grounded sense that the truth had simply taken its time finding its way back to daylight. Boone clasped his shoulder and told him that whatever happened next, at least the record would finally say what actually occurred, and Callum nodded, unwilling yet to celebrate anything until Vivienne herself understood the full weight of what she had signed away. When Blackwood missed its repayment deadline, ownership of the secondary runway, Hangar 7, and the ground control rights for the Eastern Airfield transferred automatically to Callum's small company under the terms of the original loan agreement. Moments later, a notification reached Vivienne's office, informing her that the secondary runway was no longer under Blackwood Aero's operational authority. She read the message twice before the meaning fully registered, and, for the first time that morning, her composure cracked. Vivienne marched down to the hangar district with Prescott, her legal team, and 2 company security guards trailing behind her, demanding that Callum be removed immediately for trespassing on private property. Her voice carried across the open tarmac with an authority meant to remind everyone present exactly who ran Blackwood Aero, and for a moment the guards hesitated, uncertain whether to follow her order or wait for confirmation from their own chain of command. Prescott urged them forward, insisting that whatever paperwork Callum carried had to be fabricated, since no former employee could plausibly hold ownership over property this valuable. Nolan Greer stepped forward, tablet in hand, and positioned himself directly between the guards and Callum before anyone could touch him. He had spent the better part of an hour on the phone with the Airfield Registry Office confirming every detail twice before walking down to the hangar himself, unwilling to act on anything less than absolute certainty given what was at stake. In front of Vivienne and everyone gathered, he stated plainly that according to updated records from the Airfield Registry and the Hawthorne Trust, Callum Reed was the lawful owner of Hangar 7, the secondary runway, and ground control rights for the eastern sector. The air seemed to freeze around them, and Vivienne demanded he repeat himself, certain she had misheard. Nolan calmly explained that from this moment forward, any Blackwood aircraft wishing to use the secondary runway would require Callum's explicit authorization, a detail confirmed by the documentation now displayed on his tablet. Prescott tried to interject, insisting this had to be some clerical error, but the legal paperwork Nolan carried left no room for that argument. Callum did not gloat or raise his voice. He only said that 3 years ago she had used this badge to lock him outside the gate, and today she was the one handing it back. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivienne lost control of a situation entirely, and she turned toward the horizon where the delegation's 3 private jets were already descending through worsening weather. The operations center confirmed the storm had intensified faster than forecast, pushing crosswinds at the main runway well past safe operating limits. Callum's secondary runway sat at an angle that made it the only realistic option for a safe landing, and everyone in that hangar understood exactly what that meant. Vivienne had no choice but to request permission to use the runway, and after the humiliation she had just endured in front of her own staff, she found it nearly impossible to soften her tone. Standing at the edge of the tarmac with rain beginning to streak the windows behind her, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. The unsettling sense that the ground beneath her family's company had shifted overnight, and that she no longer fully understood who actually controlled it. Prescott suggested diverting the incoming jets to a different airfield entirely, but that option risked signaling to the investors that Blackwood's operations were unreliable at the exact moment they needed to appear flawless. If the delegation lost confidence and withdrew from the deal, Vivienne's position as chief executive would not survive the fallout, and she understood that her father's legacy would collapse along with it. Callum listened to the control tower's radio traffic and recognized that one of the incoming pilots was struggling with a secondary navigation system disrupted by the storm, a problem he had handled personally more than once during his years as an engineer. Though he now held every advantage imaginable, he refused to treat the safety of an aircraft and its passengers as a bargaining chip in his dispute with Vivienne. He granted permission for the jets to use his runway under one condition. Every technical decision would follow proper safety protocol, and no pilot would be pressured to land before conditions were truly safe. Vivienne agreed reluctantly, and Prescott's frustration deepened as he watched control slip further from his grasp with each passing minute. In the operations room, Callum directed the ground crew himself, instructing them to activate the backup runway lighting, verify wind direction readings, position emergency vehicles along the taxiway, and coordinate fuel logistics for the arriving aircraft. The younger staff on duty had never worked a storm diversion of this scale, and they followed his instructions with the quiet trust of people who recognized competence the moment they saw it, regardless of what title he did or did not hold. Rain hammered the windows of the operations room as radar showed the first jet beginning its final approach, wings rocking gently against gusts that pushed hard from the west. Callum kept his voice level over the radio, reading out wind corrections and confirming runway conditions with the same unhurried calm he had used years earlier during dozens of ordinary shifts. The pilot thanked him quietly over the channel, unaware that the man guiding her down safely had been publicly humiliated in a boardroom less than 2 hours before. The first jet touched down without incident, its wheels throwing up a fine mist of rainwater as it rolled toward the taxiway, followed soon after by the second aircraft descending through the same narrow corridor of stable air. The third jet struggled more than the others, catching a sudden crosswind gust just before touchdown that pushed its nose several degrees off-center. Callum watched the radar feed and issued a short, precise correction to the pilot, then instructed the ground crew to position foam trucks along the runway as a precaution rather than a certainty. The landing gear touched hard but held, and the aircraft rolled to a stop well within the marked distance, drawing a long exhale from everyone watching the monitors. Callum guided the ground team through a calm, methodical response that brought the aircraft to a safe stop without injury or damage, and only then did he allow himself a brief breath of relief before turning back to the paperwork waiting on the desk beside him. The investors on board witnessed the entire sequence unfold from their cabin windows, and it was not Vivienne or Prescott who earned their confidence that afternoon. It was the man they had watched being mocked in a boardroom less than an hour earlier. One investor turned to a colleague as they disembarked and asked why Blackwood Aero had introduced this man as a former employee who had been dismissed, when he had clearly just guided their landing through a genuine crisis. Vivienne had no good answer, and the silence that followed stretched long enough for several investors to exchange uneasy glances among themselves. Prescott quickly claimed that Callum carried an old disciplinary record, Attempting to drag the conversation back toward the story they had told for 3 years, his voice slightly too loud for the size of the room. Callum did not respond with anger. He simply produced a copy of the original maintenance log from that fateful day, proof that Prescott himself had pressured the technical team to bypass a documented hydraulic warning before that long-ago flight. Boone Calder confirmed that the original data had been deleted from Blackwood's central servers years earlier, but a backup copy had remained untouched inside Hangar 7's own systems, now under Callum's control. Lydia Hawthorne, representing the trust, arrived with additional legal documentation confirming that her organization had investigated the circumstances surrounding the original loan default well before finalizing the transfer of ownership. Vivian began to grasp, in that moment, how thoroughly she had been manipulated by the man standing beside her for years, though her pride kept her from admitting it openly in front of the investors. She remained skeptical of Callum as well, unwilling to simply hand her trust to a man she barely knew anymore. And that hesitation gave the confrontation real tension rather than an easy resolution. Prescott, sensing the room turning against him, insisted that ancient history mattered less than saving the deal in front of them right now. Callum countered that the ancient history was precisely why Blackwood found itself in crisis in the first place, since no airline could survive built on a foundation of concealed technical failures and buried warnings. One of the investors, a soft-spoken woman named Margaret Whitfield who had said little throughout the meeting, asked Prescott directly why the inspection timestamps in the archived records did not match the flight logs filed with regulators that same week. Prescott stumbled over his answer, offering an explanation about clerical inconsistency that satisfied no one in the room, least of all Vivian, who watched him with an expression that had shifted from loyalty to open suspicion. Lydia then revealed an additional detail buried within the trust's documentation. Because Blackwood had violated transparency requirements and misused collateralized assets, Callum's company held not only the secondary runway, but also the standing right to block the pending sale of the eastern airfield entirely. She explained the mechanism plainly for the benefit of the investors, noting that the original loan agreement included a clause allowing the debt holder to freeze any sale of collateralized property if the borrower was found to have concealed material safety violations. Prescott argued that the clause could not possibly apply retroactively, but Lydia produced the original signed agreement, its language unambiguous, and reminded the room that Blackwood's own legal department had approved these terms decades earlier without complaint. Prescott's face drained of color as the implications set in, and Vivienne finally understood that the deal she had been about to sign might have been designed from the start to let Prescott and his associates seize her family's property at a fraction of its value. Vivienne walked alone into Hangar 7 later that evening, seeking Callum without her lawyers or her guards trailing behind her for the first time all day. She asked him directly what he actually wanted from her, whether it was money, a title, or simple revenge for what had been done to him. Callum told her that if revenge had been his goal, he would have closed the runway in the middle of the storm and let the consequences speak for themselves. What he wanted instead was for the truth to be corrected, for his name to be cleared in the company's own records, and for Blackwood Aero to stop making decisions that treated flight safety as an inconvenience. Vivienne looked around the hangar for the first time in years, noticing the marks her father had left behind, including an old sign bolted to the wall that read a simple line, "An aircraft does not forgive pride." The words struck something in her, forcing her to recognize how completely she had placed her own reputation and authority above the truth for far too long. She admitted, quietly and without her usual composure, that she had never once questioned Prescott's account of that final flight, trusting him simply because trusting him had always been easier than doing the work of verifying anything herself. Callum listened without offering comfort or absolution, aware that an admission spoken under pressure meant little until it was tested by what came next. He told her plainly that trust without verification was exactly how companies like this one lost their way, and that her father had understood that lesson better than anyone until the business itself grew too large for one person to watch closely. Callum mentioned his daughter only once, briefly, saying he did not want her growing up believing her father had stayed silent while being called a liar. He kept the reference brief and grounded, giving the moment emotional weight without turning the scene into something it did not need to be. Vivian asked, almost hesitantly, how he had managed to keep working through those years without any income or reputation to fall back on, and Callum answered that some nights had been harder than she could imagine, but that quitting had never once felt like an option worth considering. Vivian's posture softened slightly, though before she could respond further, Prescott interrupted with an urgent call, warning that the investors were threatening to withdraw their funding unless the sale was signed immediately. Callum recognized the tactic instantly, understanding that Prescott wanted Vivian to sign before the fraud evidence could be made public and derail the deal on his terms. He offered her a choice with no middle ground. She could follow Prescott's path and lose the airfield entirely, or she could walk into that boardroom beside him and unravel the agreement before it destroyed what remained of her family's company. Inside the boardroom, Prescott tried desperately to control the narrative, painting Callum as an outsider exploiting the company's crisis to seize what never belonged to him. Vivian stayed silent for a long, uncomfortable moment, leaving everyone in the room uncertain which side she intended to choose. Then she did something nobody expected. She ordered the original maintenance logs from Hangar 7 displayed on the main screen for every investor present to examine for themselves. The data showed exactly what Callum had claimed, revealing that Prescott had altered inspection timestamps and deleted a documented safety warning years earlier, then used the resulting failure to remove Callum from the company entirely. The investors began directing sharp questions at Prescott, demanding explanations he could not provide under this kind of scrutiny. Lydia Hawthorne added that the group purchasing the Eastern Airfield maintained financial ties to a shell company connected directly to Prescott himself, confirming he had engineered the entire sale to benefit his own hidden interests. Prescott had planned to force Blackwood into selling valuable property at a depressed price, then quietly acquire the secondary runway once the company's operations collapsed under the weight of its own missed obligations. Vivian finally understood that Callum had never been trying to destroy her. He had been standing between her and a trap she nearly walked into willingly. Callum, for his part, did not transform into an easy savior figure, keeping a clear distance from Vivian even as the truth came out, since 3 years of public humiliation could not be erased by a single moment of vindication. Prescott was removed from the meeting immediately, and his records were forwarded to financial investigators, resolved through documentation and institutional pressure rather than any physical confrontation. Vivian turned to Callum in front of the entire room and admitted she had been wrong about him, and he answered that being wrong does not destroy a company. Pride does that all on its own. With Prescott gone, Blackwood Aero still was not safe, since the company needed the secondary runway, Hangar 7, and Callum's operational authorization to preserve its contract with the delegation of investors. Power now rested entirely with the single father who had been thrown off the property months earlier, and Vivian offered to purchase the assets back at a generous price, hoping to resolve the matter quickly and quietly. Callum declined an immediate sale and instead laid out 3 conditions before any further negotiation could proceed. First, Blackwood Aero would publicly correct his personnel file and remove every false allegation tied to his dismissal. Second, all flight safety decisions would fall under the oversight of an independent review board, insulated from executive pressure of any kind. Third, Hangar 7 would become a training center for aviation technicians drawn from ordinary working backgrounds, rather than remaining a symbol reserved for the wealthy and well-connected. Vivian found the third condition unusual and asked him to explain his reasoning. Callum told her that he had once been a man with no name and no money trying to break into an industry that rarely opened its doors to people like him, and he wanted the very place that had cast him out to instead become a place that welcomed people just like the man he used to be. He described nights spent studying second-hand manuals under a single desk lamp, unable to afford formal training programs that assumed a level of wealth he never had growing up, and he said no young mechanic with real talent should have to fight that hard simply to be given a fair chance. Vivian listened without interrupting, aware that her own path into the company had required none of the struggle Callum described, since her surname alone had opened doors that remained closed to almost everyone else in the industry. The investors responded warmly to the idea, recognizing an opportunity to reframe the company's crisis as the beginning of a genuine transformation rather than another scandal to bury. Margaret Whitfield remarked that companies remembered for correcting their mistakes openly often earned more long-term loyalty than companies that never appeared to make mistakes at all, and several of her colleagues nodded in quiet agreement. Blackwood Arrow could stop representing only wealth and privilege and start representing a company that placed safety and people above raw power, a shift that would take years to prove genuine but had to begin somewhere concrete and visible. Vivian asked how soon the training center could realistically open its doors, and Callum answered that Boone Calder had already agreed to help design the first curriculum himself, since nobody understood the practical gaps in technical training better than a mechanic who had spent decades on the hangar floor. Vivian agreed to every condition, and though she was not humiliated into submission, she was given a real opportunity to make amends through action rather than empty apology. She asked for a single day to review the language with her own legal counsel, a request Callum granted without hesitation, understanding that trust rebuilt too quickly rarely held under real pressure. When she returned the following morning, she brought not only her signature but a handwritten note acknowledging, in her own words, the years her company had spent protecting convenience over honesty. This gave the story a depth beyond simple retribution, allowing her character room to grow rather than collapse entirely. To preserve the deal, Vivian still needed to fly the delegation on a demonstration flight aboard one of the company's newest jets, but after everything that had unfolded, nobody trusted the existing leadership team to handle it alone. The scheduled pilot was stranded at another airfield due to the storm, threatening to cancel the flight altogether at the worst possible moment. Callum still held a commercial pilot's license and knew this particular aircraft intimately from his years overseeing its maintenance, and Vivian asked for his help without issuing a single order this time. She approached him with something resembling genuine respect, a tone he had not heard from her in 3 long years. Callum agreed, on the condition that every safety check be completed properly and without shortcuts of any kind, a requirement Vivian accepted without hesitation this time. He walked across the tarmac in an old flight jacket, the badge on his chest no longer a symbol of a man discarded by the company, but a mark of someone who had reclaimed control over his own future. Boone Calder ran the pre-flight inspection alongside him, checking each system twice out of habit rather than necessity, and the two men worked in the same easy rhythm they had shared years earlier before everything that had fallen apart between them and the company. The flight required no manufactured danger to hold its tension, since the stakes came from the pressure of the moment itself. Investors watching closely Vivian seated quietly behind him, and every decision he made reflecting the calm professionalism that had defined his career from the beginning. As the jet taxied toward the runway, Vivian watched Callum's hands move across the controls with a steadiness that made her wonder how the company had ever convinced itself this man posed any kind of threat. Margaret Whitfield leaned toward a colleague and remarked quietly that she had flown with executives who inspired far less confidence than this supposedly disgraced former employee now sitting at the controls ahead of them. Her colleague nodded, adding that whatever internal politics had unfolded at Blackwood Aero over the years, none of it mattered nearly as much as watching a steady hand guide an aircraft safely through weather like this. He guided the aircraft up through the clearing clouds left behind by the storm, then brought it down smoothly onto the very runway that now belonged to him. When the jet rolled to a stop, Nolan Greer and the ground crew stood at attention, and nobody in that crowd mocked Callum Reed any longer. One of the investors told Vivian plainly that they would continue with the deal, but only if Callum Reed remained involved in overseeing flight safety and retained his ownership stake in the Eastern operations. Vivian looked at the man she had once discarded without a second thought, and understood clearly that he was the only person capable of keeping Blackwood Aero flying at all, a realization that settled over her slowly rather than arriving as sudden relief. Several weeks later, Blackwood Aero held a public announcement detailing its restructuring, and Vivian stood before her employees and formally apologized to Callum, admitting that his original termination had been based entirely on falsified records. His name was restored in the company's official history as the engineer who had once prevented a serious technical disaster from becoming a tragedy. Callum did not return as an employee. He became a co-owner of the Eastern Operations Division and chairman of the newly formed Independent Flight Safety Board, a position built specifically around the principles he had fought to protect his entire career. Hangar 7 was renamed the Reed Aviation Training Center, a place dedicated to training young technicians, veterans, and skilled workers who had no existing connections inside the industry. Vivian did not transform into someone entirely different overnight, and the story kept its ending honest rather than sentimental, leaving a quiet tension of mutual respect between two people who understood each other differently now. She told him she had given him back an old badge, yet somehow he had given her back an entire airfield in return. Callum answered simply that he had not given her an airfield at all. He had only given this place back its truth, and the rest, he added, was hers to build honestly from here forward. Boone Calder took charge of the training center's early curriculum, exactly as promised, recruiting a small group of instructors from among the technicians who had scattered to other airfields years earlier, many of whom returned the moment they heard Callum's name attached to the project. Nolan Greer eventually earned a formal promotion overseeing security for both the main terminal and the Eastern Operations Division, a role that finally matched the quiet diligence he had shown from the very beginning. Prescott's case moved slowly through financial investigators, and while the story chose not to dwell on courtroom proceedings, the documentation Callum and Lydia had assembled ensured accountability would follow him regardless of how long it took to resolve. Lydia Hawthorne continued advising the trust on future partnerships, quietly proud of the role her late colleague Walter had played in setting these events into motion long before anyone else understood what he had seen coming. In the final moments, Callum walked through the security checkpoint one last time that week, and the scanner blinked green as it always had. Nolan Greer smiled and greeted him warmly, calling him by name as though nothing had ever been in question. A group of new trainees crossed the tarmac in the distance, on their way to their first orientation session inside the renamed hangar, laughing quietly among themselves the way young people do when a future finally feels possible. Behind them, a private jet lifted off into a clear morning sky, and the old badge resting against Callum's chest no longer carried the weight of humiliation. It had become, instead, the key that reopened his honor, his authority, and every future still ahead of him, both his own and the ones now beginning inside the walls that had once cast him out.